Hello everybody and welcome back again to one more video about Assassin's Creed Origins. It's my obligatory final verdict and discussion video. But before I get into the actual discussion part, I have an updated schedule announcement for those of you who haven't seen it on my Twitter or my channel page. As I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a slightly longer break this time because I'll be on vacation. I'll be gone for about 2 weeks. But since I did pre-record a few episodes, the break is not going to be the entire 2 weeks, but it's going to be about 10 days. So starting tomorrow, there won't be any uploads for 10 days. And then on October the 21st, that's a Wednesday, I'll be back with the first episode of Horizon Zero Dawn, and on the 22nd there'll be the first episode of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And speaking of Odyssey, I would like to talk a little bit about my plans for that game, because as we've seen with this Let's Play, these quote-unquote new Assassin's Creed games are pretty lengthy. I mean, for once I feel the main mission might be a little bit longer, but more importantly, there is a lot more side content that is a lot longer because it has a lot more story than in previous games, and the maps are bigger and there's much more to explore. And as you've seen in this game, I went for the mercilessly completionist approach. I did absolutely everything, every side mission, every landmark. I picked up every treasure. No captain and commander remained unkilled, so I really finished all of it. I haven't even done that for most of the previous Assassin's Creed games, like Syndicate and Unity and Rogue, where I left some side missions unfinished. But I wanted to do it with this game for two reasons. First of all, it is the first one of the quote-unquote new Assassin's Creed games that I'm playing, so I wanted to get the full experience and see what it's all about. And most importantly, it's ancient Egypt, so it's very close to my heart, and I just wanted to do it all. So that's why you got this very, very completionist playthrough. However, I don't think I will be doing that for Odyssey. While I am interested in the subject matter, it is not as important to me as ancient Egypt. So I want to cut down the amount of episodes for that Let's Play by, I don't know, maybe a third, ideally maybe by half. That means I will focus on the main mission. I will be doing some side missions when there's time in an episode. I might be doing DLC if they are important enough in story terms. We will see about that. But I will cut a lot more stuff from the Let's Play to cut down the amount of episodes a little bit. I may or may not do stuff off camera. We will see about that. You know, sometimes I actually enjoy playing off camera for a while and not having to do commentary. And I even enjoy doing all these menial, kind of repetitive side tasks. I don't know. I feel it's oddly relaxing to just run around and pick up treasures or infiltrate forts. So I actually had fun doing that, especially if I can just do it for myself without having to record it. So yeah, one way or the other, Odyssey is going to be a little bit shorter in terms of episodes, even though the game is actually longer, I believe. But I want to cut down the amount of content that I will actually show on camera. And I mean, you can give me pointers what side content I definitely should do on camera because it's like really important or whatever. But for the most part, I want to focus on the main story and like the most important side content to be done on camera. But yeah, now let's go and talk about Origins. And if you have watched some of my verdict videos before, you know that I usually tend to focus a little bit more on the issues that I have with a game than the good parts, because it's more interesting than just to say this was nice and this was nice and this was nice. However, I don't really have that many issues with this game, to be honest. I guess there's like maybe one bigger issue and a number of smaller ones and some nitpicky issues maybe, but it's really not all that much. But yeah, let's maybe, as always, start with the technical aspects, the game design and the gameplay. As far as game design, as in graphics and so on goes, well, what is there to say? The game looks amazing. It's super gorgeous. All the environments look really, really pretty. I've never seen so beautiful deserts before in my life. Then again, I've never actually seen a desert in real life. The closest thing to a desert that I've seen is like the giant sand dunes on Gran Canaria, which look pretty much like the ones in the Sahara Desert, just on a much smaller area. But yeah, it looks really pretty. And in addition to that, there was a surprising amount of variety that I really didn't expect, because we don't just have like the contrast between the desert and the lush green Nile area, but then there's like the Nile Delta, which is very swampy, and the deserts looked all different. There were sandy deserts and rocky deserts and white deserts. So I was actually rather surprised by that. And then they included like Cyrenaica with a more Mediterranean climate and environment. So yeah, I was surprised by the amount of different locations. As a matter of fact, before I started the game, I was wondering how they would do this, because I felt, okay, you wanna have an open world game in ancient Egypt. Obviously, you do wanna have like the most important landmarks in your game, like the pyramids. But then you probably want to have some important temples in there as well, and they are not anywhere nearby the pyramids. So how do you put that into one open world game? And I thought that maybe they were going for like the same approach as they did in Assassin's Creed 3, where we had different maps for like the cities and then the open world, the nature setting, so to speak, or kind of like a Dragon Age Inquisition approach with a number of smaller open world maps for different locations, which I guess I kind of did for the DLC, but the main game was all one big continuous map, which I didn't expect, and it was pretty amazing. And they achieved that by an odd but kind of clever trick, because they basically reduced all the proportions of the distances. So it was almost like a miniature version of Egypt, or an amusement park version of Egypt, where you had all the big attractions in a relatively small area. And as a result, you could like see the pyramids while standing on the lighthouse of Pharos, which was odd, but it worked. So I thought it was actually a pretty clever way to deal with it. So you had one open world map, but still you had a bunch of different cities and landmarks and attractions in that one map. And yes, the cities also seemed not just significantly smaller than we had in previous games, obviously, but I feel they were also significantly smaller than they would have been in real life. I mean, Alexandria seemed like really, really small for like the capital of Egypt, even in proportion to like London, for example. So yeah, they definitely shrunk everything a little bit. But, you know, in the end, I thought it worked out well. And while I'm talking about the map design, maybe a few words on how they integrated the quests into the map. Because I thought that for about, well, 80% of the game, it worked out pretty well. And towards the end, it kind of fell apart a little bit. So, for the most part, the quest design was pretty intelligent. So you started in a relatively small but open starter area, which was Siwa. So you could start to learn how to play this game. And after that, they sent you out into the full open world. And then you could just follow the main mission, and it would take you from one region to the next. And in each region, you would have a number of landmarks and side quests, and then you could do the side quests and then move on with the main mission and go to the next region. And it almost felt a little bit like a road trip around Egypt because of that, since at that point you weren't really backtracking a lot, you were mostly just going from one place to the next. And very often the side missions in the various regions would in some form correspond or relate to the main mission you've just been doing. So yeah, that was pretty well designed until maybe like 80% of the game, when it kind of broke down a little bit. Because, I mean, for once the main plot started to thicken, and it took you back to places you've been to already, while at the same time you still had a number of unexplored regions with a bunch of side quests. And the balance between the main mission and the side missions felt a little bit off towards the end. Especially since the plot started to thicken, you wanted to focus on the main mission. But at some point, I kind of had to take a longer break and start to explore all of these other regions to finish the stuff in these places before I could continue with the main mission. I mean, technically I don't have to do this. I can just finish the main mission and then finish off all the other regions afterwards. But personally, I always prefer to finish all the side content before I finish the main mission, because otherwise it feels kinda anticlimactic to me. So yeah, for the most part, I thought the balance between the main content and the side content, and the way that it would lead you around the map and help you explore this giant map, was pretty well made. But in the end, it felt that the balance was a little bit off, and there was too much side content when you really wanted to focus on the main story. So that maybe would be a minor issue that I would have. And yes, I mean, a lot of the side content was kind of repetitive, like the treasures and the animal layers and all that stuff. But I guess you don't have to do it unless you really need to level up. But if you don't want to level up, you could just play on a lower difficulty, and then maybe you don't have to be like level 55. Also, I did enable that one option where my enemies would basically adjust to my level. If you don't use that option, you don't really have to be that high a level that I have, so you can safely skip most of the side content, I feel. But like I said, I actually enjoyed doing it, especially when I could just play for like an hour off camera, and I thought it was kind of relaxing. But that's just me. So yeah, that's about maybe the general map design. Let's talk about the gameplay as such, like the combat maybe. Obviously, it was significantly different from the previous games in that I guess there was not such a strong focus on the stealth approach. And I suppose that's why a lot of people think that this isn't really an Assassin's Creed game. Yeah, I can kinda understand it. However, it does depend to some degree on how you choose to play the game. You don't have to be stealthy. There's no like desynchronization if you get detected at any point in the game, as far as I can tell. So you can technically play every mission in like open combat. Just storm into the camps and take on all the soldiers in melee or in sword fighting. If you're good enough at the melee combat, that is. But you can just as well infiltrate it, and I thought the stealth mechanics, as they were in the game, were actually pretty decent. So, you could hide, you could disable signal fires, you could send out Senyu to do some reconnaissance, which I thought was a pretty neat addition, because it helped you to plan your infiltration in ways that you couldn't do before. I thought that was pretty enjoyable. So you could play, I would say, about 90% of the game in stealth mode. Of course, there are some battles that were basically forced on you. There were a few boss battles that happened like after cutscenes where you had no option to be stealthy. And on a few occasions, I encountered enemies during infiltrations that were so strong that even an assassination wouldn't kill them, so I had to engage them in combat. But all things considered, it wasn't really that often that this happened. Yes, it happened from time to time, and I remember the first time I was thrown into one of these obligatory battles. I was a little bit thrown off because I hadn't really done much of that combat until then. I think it may have been like the ceremonial battle at the Temple of Sekhmet, which was like the first boss battle. I don't remember, but it may have been that one. And that one you could just repeat if you failed because it wasn't like a real battle. But I feel at that point you knew that, okay, there are going to be actual boss battles in this game, so I should prepare myself for that, and I should invest some points into my warrior skills, for example. I can understand that some people are not a big fan of these forced boss battles. As a matter of fact, if I think of another stealthy game that I played a few years ago, which is Deus Ex Human Revolution, that was a game where a similar thing happened. You know, it was basically a stealth game. You could play it non-stealthily if you wanted to. But I was going for the stealthy and non-lethal approach, and then I was forced to fight boss battles in open combat because they were not designed for stealthy or non-lethal takedowns. And that was very irritating, as I remember. But in that case, it was irritating because you had to level up your character for either the stealthy approach or like more the blunt force approach. And you had to take certain weapons with you with limited inventory space. So if you had focused so much on the stealthy approach, you were not very well equipped for the combat. And I remember the first boss battle in that game. I had to fight a pretty strong enemy, and all I had was a damn stun gun. A stun gun that didn't even work on this boss because I had to kill him. I couldn't just stun him. And I spent most of that battle hiding in a vent. And I think I was trying to throw a few grenades at him because those were some of the few lethal weapons I actually had. But I didn't get the same impression in this game because for once I could still like improve my armor and pick up better weapons without compromising my stealth skills. And there were so many ability points to go around that I never felt that I had to compromise my warrior skills if I wanted to focus on stealthy skills. As a matter of fact, there weren't really that many specifically stealthy skills, I would say. I guess there were a few that would help you with infiltration, but for the most part, I think you could build a pretty balanced character and you didn't really have to say, okay, I'm going to make a stealth build and then be woefully under prepared for the boss battles. So I didn't think it was so bad that you had to fight a few battles in open combat. Also, I may just have a different perspective on that since I played all the Assassin's Creed games in a relatively short amount of time. I mean, they were released over a span of, I think, 9 years if we start with Assassin's Creed 2. I mean, I've played one, but that is even longer ago. And I played these games that were released in 9 years in a little less under 3 years. Yes, it's been 3 years. I looked it up. I started Assassin's Creed 2 in December 2018. So it's been a while. But still, I played them almost continuously. So I was ready for something new. And I don't really mind the fact that there is a bigger focus on open combat in this game. Because I thought there was still a lot of stealth to go around, and I enjoyed the stealthy parts for what they were. So yeah, for the most part, I thought the combat was fine with me. Also, the free running and parkouring, of course, there was less focus on that too, since you don't have these huge city landscapes of previous games. But I thought it still worked pretty well. Usually Assassin's Creed games always have some slight quirks somewhere in the gameplay. Didn't really notice any here. It all worked pretty well, and everything was pretty fluid. So yeah, gameplay is fine with me, and I enjoy the new style of gameplay. And I won't be mad if the next games are going to be of a similar kind. So I'm looking forward to that. Alright, now maybe let's talk a little bit about story and characters. Well, as far as the story is concerned, there isn't much to say either, because it is a very typical Assassin's Creed story. It starts with a murder of a beloved person, there's a tale of revenge, and then you have a list of targets, and as you work your way through these targets, you get more and more involved in like the deeper conspiracy. As a matter of fact, the story is eerily reminiscent of Assassin's Creed 2. It all starts with the murder of a family member and a vow of revenge, and then you start to take down the targets and get involved into the larger political intrigues that happen around you. And of course, there's like a precursor artifact involved. So yeah, the story is very, very similar to Assassin's Creed 2. And as such, it is obviously not specifically exciting. So story is okay, but nothing to write home about either. As a matter of fact, I would say the most interesting parts of the story were those that were like the real historical events. So the parts that weren't written by the writers, but that were just taken from history. That whole power struggle with Cleopatra and Caesar and Pompey, and the court intrigues between Cleopatra and Ptolemy. I mean, there's a reason why we still remember these events 2,000 years later, because, you know, they just make for a good story. And those were definitely interesting, but I can't give credit to the writers for that, because they just took that from the history books. So yeah, the story was a pretty typical, average Assassin's Creed story. Although it had a few interesting aspects, like for example the interactions between Bayek and Aya, or just, you know, the origin story of the Assassin's Order, which was essentially what this all was about. So that was interesting to see. But the basic plot is pretty generic. So next, maybe let's talk a little bit about our protagonist. And yes, this is the part of the game where I have my biggest issue. And you probably know what it is, because I've already talked about it, like in episode 10 or 15, I don't know, very early in the game. Now, I think it was in my verdict video for the previous Assassin's Creed game, Syndicate, where I noted that when it comes to the Assassin's Creed main games, Ubisoft apparently knows how to write exactly two different types of protagonists: the broody rebel and the charming rogue. The broody rebels are obviously Altair, Connor, Shay, and I also put Arno into that category, who started off like a charming rogue for like the first 2 hours of the game, but then very quickly became one of the broody rebels. And the charming rogues are obviously Ezio, Edward, and Jacob. And because of that, Ubisoft also has the uncanny ability to, well, very often focus on the less interesting stories. I think I mentioned that already when I reviewed Unity, in particular in regards to Arno's, well, sort of origin story, which was essentially a slight variation on the revenge topic, that the really interesting story would have been Elise's story, the Templar who grew up as a Templar, who was initiated as a Templar, and then got betrayed by the Order and was forced to work with the Assassins. That just seemed like a significantly more interesting story than what we got. And that is certainly not the only time this happened. I think I mentioned when reviewing Rogue that some of Shay's target seemed like much more interesting characters than Shay, like Kisegawase, or what was her name? Hope? Or Adewale. I mean, Adewale at least got like a spin-off game, so there's that. But there were a lot of other characters that I felt had significantly more interesting stories to tell than what we ended up with, which was Shay. Some people might argue that Haytham Kenway was a more interesting character than Connor. Or, in Syndicate, well, I feel in Syndicate that both of the main protagonists, while pretty likable, neither of them were pretty deep characters because obviously if you have to share the protagonist billing with another character, there's less time to focus on each of these characters. And a lot of their charm was basically due to their interactions with each other and not because they were pretty interesting characters in their own rights. But I still feel that if they had chosen just one character for the game and had focused on one protagonist and thus given that one character more development than they had as a shared protagonist, then it should have been Evie, because at least she could have given us a fresh perspective on these things, whereas Jacob probably just would have been Edward 2.0 in the end. So yeah, Ubisoft definitely has the habit to have all these potentially interesting characters and story ideas in their game, but then not focus on them. So why am I talking about all of these previous Assassin's Creed games and all the missed opportunities in those games? Well, because obviously it kinda happened again in this game. Now, to be clear, Bayek is a perfectly fine character. I liked Bayek a lot, he is very likable, and to his credit, he actually doesn't fall into one of these typical tropes that all the previous characters could be divided into, the broody rebel and the charming rogue. I would say he had a little bit of the broody rebel going, but it felt different this time, and I think it's because for many of the previous rebel types that we had in these games, their rebelliousness came across as pretty adolescent. I mean, I'm willing to forgive Connor for that, because he was practically an adolescent for most of the game. I'm even willing to cut Altair some slack in that regard, because he didn't really choose to be in the Assassin's Order, right? He was born into it, so I can understand that he would go through a rebel phase in some point in his life. But, I mean, Shay and Arno don't have that excuse. They chose to join their respective orders. In Shay's case, both of them actually. So their constant obstinance, which probably was intended to be like unadjusted rebelliousness on part of the writers, usually came across as rather, immature grumpiness. And that is something I can't say about Bayek. I feel that his anger against, the authorities and the rulers was genuine. And he certainly was like the most mature assassin we ever had. I mean, he was married, he was a father, he had an actual life and a career before all of this happened to him. He was not just some youngling who got thrown into all of this without any kind of life experience. And like I said, his rebelliousness against like the rulers seemed honest and genuine, and it didn't come across as some adolescent teenager who just wanted to be a rebel for the sake of being a rebel. And of course it helped that there was no actual order when he was working for most of the time, because that was always the problem in some of the previous games, that on the one hand, the order is kind of like a hierarchical organization, and the writers always seem to want to write characters that are unadjusted and don't want to follow orders and so on. So that wasn't like a huge issue in this case. So yes, Bayek is a great and likable character who was different from most of the previous assassins we had so far. So in itself, there's nothing wrong with Bayek. But I still think he should not have been the protagonist of this game. As a matter of fact, you might argue he isn't the protagonist of this game. The game just chooses to focus on him all the time, while Aya is the one being somewhere else doing all the important stuff. And that's what I meant when I said that Ubisoft has the uncanny ability to have these interesting story ideas and then not focus on them. And this is definitely another example of that. And yes, we all know why that is. They don't want to have an Assassin's Creed game with a female protagonist, like a sole female protagonist, that is. So yeah, as a result, we had Bayek doing all the stuff that almost seemed like the footwork, going around killing all the people, while Aya seemed to be like the driving force behind all of that, which is why I said you could argue that she's actually the important person here, the protagonist. She's the person who essentially pushed forward the founding of the Order and so on. And it almost seemed like Bayek was just going along with, her plans, and she kind of strung him along for all of that, while Bayek was doing all like the menial minor tasks. I mean, Aya was the one in Rome trying to build up the Order. She was the one who killed Caesar in the end. Presumably she's the one who's going to kill Cleopatra at some point. I mean, there's a reason why it's her statue in Monteriggioni and not Bayek's statue, because she's the actual important person here, right? But yeah, the game isn't showing us her story, but it's showing us Bayek's story. And like I said, Bayek is a fine character, but the story is kind of generic, and it might have been more interesting if it had focused more on Aya's story, which was happening somewhere in the background when we were not watching. So that is definitely my biggest issue with the game. I mean, yes, they kind of stayed true to the lore by saying, okay, Aya is the one who, killed, Caesar in this case, maybe Cleopatra as well. So they acknowledged that she existed and had that important of a role, but they don't actually show her a lot in the game. So again, another missed opportunity. As a matter of fact, there's a certain irony in the fact that the game kind of made it a point to emphasize that women in ancient Egypt had like more rights and a better position than in Rome, for example, or most of Greek. But in the game itself, the woman again was not allowed to be the protagonist. So yeah, there's a weird message in there somewhere. But yeah, that is essentially my biggest problem with the game. But I think this review wouldn't be complete if I didn't talk a little bit about the historical aspects of the game, because, this is ancient Egypt, a topic that I claim to know quite a bit about. Of course, like I said, I'm not an Egyptologist, I'm not a historian, this is just a hobby, so my knowledge is definitely not perfect or complete or anything. But I still would like to judge the game based on that. And, well, what can I say? I think they did a really good job with that. I mean, there's an insane amount of detail in general in this game. The cities feel really alive, not by size or crowdedness like Unity, for example, but just by the amount of detail in it. So you have people that are not just walking around, but that follow actual professions. And there's people walking the fields and singing songs while they're working the fields. There's priests in the temples performing their daily worship or whatever. I mean, at some point I was just running around playing off camera for a while, and suddenly I met like a procession of priests carrying a statue of a god on a bark from one temple to another. Nothing that related to any kind of quest that I did, just a detail of like the daily life in Egypt, and I was utterly impressed by this amount of detail that they put into this game. And this does extend to the overall design of the game. I mean, yes, there is obviously a good amount of copy and paste going on as well. So there were some temple textures that popped up in, well, pretty much every single temple. No matter if it was a temple of Amun or a temple of Sekhmet, the paintings on the walls were almost always the same. And there were certain statues of certain deities that, appeared again and again and again. But honestly, that isn't even such a big issue because, as I mentioned at some point during the game, Egyptian art was very formal, and it had a very rigid canon. So they had certain ways to portray certain deities or certain images on temples. And that canon didn't even change all that much over the course of the Egyptian history. Yes, an expert can tell you, oh, well, this statue is Old Kingdom and this one is Middle Kingdom. But I would say a normal layperson looking at these statues wouldn't be able to tell a difference, even if there's like 1,000 years in between them. So the fact that they recycled a lot of these textures doesn't really matter all that much, because that's kind of what the Egyptians did. They basically all built their temples and their statues to very similar specifications. So I wouldn't say this is like a huge problem. Also, for some very important places, they definitely tried to mix it up a little bit. For example, some of the tombs, when we found like tombs that belonged to the Amana pharaohs like Akhenaten and Smenkhare, they were decorated with very original Amana style paintings. I noted that when I found that first tomb, and I was like, oh, look at that, these are actually like original paintings from that specific period of time that was only used in that very short period of time during, the Aten reforms. So that was pretty impressive. Or, the tomb of Ramesses the Great had, well, not paintings from his tomb, but paintings from the tomb of his wife. So it was close. And I went back into the tomb of Tutankhamun after I finished the game because I wanted to go back to the Duat, and I had a closer look at the tomb. And again, they used original paintings from the original tomb of Tutankhamun to decorate the walls. So yes, they did pay a lot of attention to detail here when they could have just, reused the same temple textures again and again. But they didn't. They tried to make this as, well, close to reality as it could be. Yes, there are some embellishments and some historical inaccuracies for the sake of gameplay or design. Like I said, they decorated Ramesses' tomb not with paintings or reliefs from his tomb, but from his wife, because I guess they just looked prettier. But, these are minor details. I'll allow them because it's still pretty damn close. So yeah, I can't praise enough the amount of detail they put into this game. And I think at some point during my Let's Play I mentioned that the game is really, really good at visual storytelling. And it occurred to me while I was thinking about that this is like the first Assassin's Creed game that doesn't have like a codex or a database. I don't completely remember if the first game had one, but I assume there was a codex, but definitely every other game since Assassin's Creed 2 had like a database that was written from a modern perspective and gave you additional insights into persons, but also historical events and places. And a little bit into like the general life of that time period. This game doesn't have that. I mean, there's like the discovery tour that you can take, and I suppose it kind of replaces the database, but you don't have it during the actual game. And I think this actually is of a benefit to the game, because while I usually like the database and I like reading the codex entries for additional insights and additional knowledge, it is very easy to abuse the database as a crutch for actual storytelling. And you are probably familiar with the concept of show, don't tell. So you should show the important parts of the story in the game and not just tell it to the player. And in the end, the codex is like the epitome of tell. It's basically an info dump where you can give, additional information to the player, which is fine, but sometimes I feel they used it because they didn't really know how to portray these things in the game. I think I mentioned that when I reviewed Assassin's Creed Rogue, that we had a few lines in Shay's codex entry that basically explained to us that, he had some problems with the assassins and doubted their goals or ideals or whatever, which definitely should have been something that is part of the game and not part of a codex entry. And I would say there's other examples of that as well, where, you can just dump important information into the codex. It's a lot easier than trying to actually show it in the game. But this game didn't have a database, so all the important information had to be conveyed visually via the game, and I think they did a perfect job at that. I mean, let's look at Alexandria, for example. I think you don't have to be a historian to notice that there is an obvious difference between the Greek part of town and the Egyptian part, and that the Greek part is obviously more affluent, and that all the important people seem to be in the Greek part, whereas the people in the Egyptian part are significantly poorer. As a matter of fact, when I was in the library, I mentioned that apparently the only people in that library that weren't Greek, or male for that matter, were the cleaning ladies, who were Egyptian. And that is good visual storytelling. It tells you something about how the society works and about the relationship between the Greeks and the Egyptians in Alexandria. And it was able to do that without dumping all that information into a codex entry. I feel this is something that would have been part of a database entry in other previous games. A short explanation that, the Greeks are basically the rulers in this place and the Egyptians are only there for the menial labor and so on. But you didn't really need that. I think everyone could understand it by just, looking around that town. Or, we had that one temple that was being deconstructed. Again, no need to tell us that the temple was being deconstructed, because you could literally see it, how they would, move the stones away from the temple. So again, they were really, really good at, telling us what is going on in this world and giving us insights into the life of the Egyptians and the Greek and so on, without having to spell it out for us. The only kind of additional explanation that we got was that sometimes Bayek had his inner monologue that would, explain a few details that might not be obvious at first glance. So when we went to a temple, he might say, oh, well, this is like a statue of Amun, which is fine, because not everyone would be able to recognize a statue of Amun when they see it. But that was basically the only kind of telling that the game did. Basically, Bayek was giving us some explanations on certain, situations or certain elements of the world that we encountered. But for the most part, the game heavily relied on visual storytelling, and it did it really, really well. And maybe another thing that is worth talking about is the question of whether this game is a fair portrayal of Cleopatra. And, well, I'm not entirely sure about that. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure if it's a very fair portrayal of Caesar, for that matter. Because there was that one scene where he was talking to Ptolemy, and I think I did mention even before it happened that, Pompey is going to get killed once he reaches Egypt. Ptolemy, or well, one of his advisors, I think Pothinus, basically had him killed because he felt that he could win Caesar's favor by doing so. But by all accounts, Caesar was pretty upset by that, and he didn't appreciate it at all. And in this game, well, he was upset for like a whole 10 seconds. And then he basically went back to business and was like, okay, let's continue our negotiations. So, yeah, I feel they only included his like short moment of anger to pay lip service to the historical accounts. But after that, he was just back to business again. But I feel in other situations, they gave a pretty interesting look at Caesar, like when he was talking about his ambitions and his dreams to emulate Alexander the Great. I thought that was pretty interesting because I felt it did a pretty good job at showing us what a towering and idolized figure Alexander the Great was in the ancient world. Not just among the Greeks, but also the Romans and many other nations of the ancient world, and what a cultural and historical impact he had on many cultures. But yeah, going back to Cleopatra, I thought it was an interesting portrayal of her, although not a very unique one. It is one that you would expect and one that you've seen in other media. They also did fall a little bit into that whole, oh, well, she's in Rome sleeping around with Caesar instead of, trying to protect her people or something like that. And I feel that is not a fair assessment because, yes, she was sleeping with Caesar and she was in Rome, basically being his mistress. But, I mean, she was doing it precisely to secure Egyptians' independence because Rome obviously would at some point have invaded Egypt. And she thought, if I can keep Caesar on my side, then I will be able to make sure that Egypt stays independent. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel that aspect maybe got a little bit neglected in this game. But, I mean, I understand why that is. It's an Assassin's Creed game, which means that everyone who is, like, in power is basically one of the bad guys. It's one of the guys that we're going to kill. So, yeah, I understand why it is, but I think I should mention that, there's more ambiguity to her than they showed in this game. I feel that they were trying to portray it a little bit, but in the end it didn't really come across that much. Alright, and maybe finally, let's say a few words on the DLCs. I mean, I already talked about the first one, the Hidden Ones, which was fine, mostly because it gave us some insights into the early years of the Assassin's Order. On the other hand, it felt a little bit underwhelming in a sense that they put it into a new area, a new region, but they didn't really do much with that region. The city looked like every other city we've been to. The surroundings looked nice, but not super unique. I mean, there were more rocky desert kind of stuff. So if they were going to, have a DLC that is set in a different region, they could have picked a more exotic one, I suppose. I don't know. But as for the second DLC, The Curse of the Pharaohs, I actually really enjoyed that. This DLC certainly was leaning a lot into the fantasy elements, which, well, you might argue that previously the game was more like science fiction and less fantasy, and the Isu were, not actually gods. They were just a society with very, very highly evolved technology. And the Apple of Edens are not like supernatural artifacts, but just like technology that we don't understand. But in this DLC, it certainly felt a lot more like something supernatural was going on here. I mean, the DLC is kind of ambiguous about it. If we think back of the main game, we had like one like adventure in the underworld fighting against Apep, the giant snake, but that basically could still be explained as drug-induced visions. But the different afterlife places we visited in that DLC, again, the game was very ambiguous about it. I mean, at some point, Bayek said something like, no, I wasn't actually in the afterlife, it's just like a vision. So I guess it could be like something that is due to ISU technology that can cause people to see visions and stuff that doesn't actually exist. So we are not entirely sure if these afterlives actually exist and if the gods actually exist and if it is somehow connected to the ISU, if they actually like functioned as gods to the ancient people and brought them to an afterlife in some form. The game doesn't really answer that question, which is fine with me because, you know, it gives a certain mystery to this. So, does this really exist? Was Bayek actually in the afterlife? It kind of seems like it. I mean, he was traveling back and forth, and then someone died in the real world, and then he could go to the afterlife and visit him there. That is a very elaborate vision, right? So it almost seemed like, you know, this does exist, and the afterlife exists, and the Egyptian gods existed. So, yeah, that is certainly pretty interesting, and I wonder if this is just something they're going to cover in this particular DLC, or if this is something that's going to come up in the future. But I like this DLC. These different afterlife regions looked amazing, and they could just completely go all out on them because they didn't have to be like historically correct or whatever, and they could just, you know, be really creative about them. I mean, I guess they were still kind of correct in a sense, in that they were inspired by descriptions that we found in Egyptian texts of the afterlife to some degree. But I feel that the writers or the designers really enjoyed, you know, being able to be like really creative with it, and not just copying like actual historical places, but creating something entirely new and weird and fantastical. And I actually really liked exploring these places. So yeah, I definitely liked that DLC. So maybe to finally summarize, I really, really enjoyed this game. I would even say this is my favorite Assassin's Creed game so far. Of course, I am terribly biased in that regard because it's ancient Egypt. So I think no other game has a real chance to stand against that, no matter how good it is. The weak points are obviously the generic story that could have been a lot better if they had actually dared to focus on Aya, because she was doing most of the important and interesting stuff, I feel, like building the actual order and going to Rome and whatnot. So yeah, Bayek was a great character, but this should not have been his story. As a matter of fact, I would say it wasn't his story, it was Aya's story. We just didn't get to be a witness to that story because we were stuck with Bayek for most of the time. But still, I enjoyed this. And I'm really looking forward towards the next Assassin's Creed game, which, as I said, is going to start on October the 22nd. It's Ancient Greece, which is a topic that I know some stuff about, but I am not nearly as knowledgeable about it as Ancient Egypt. So it's going to be interesting for me because I'm sure I can learn a lot of stuff from that game. And I finally get to play an Assassin's Creed main game with a female protagonist from start to finish. Oh, what a miracle! It finally happened in game number 11. So yeah, let me know what you thought about this game, and I hope that you're looking forward to the next game, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and also Horizon Zero Dawn. But for now, I'm going off on my vacation, so you can spend that time, I don't know, rewatching some of my older series, maybe, if you're bored. And then we will meet again in about 10 days. So, as always, thank you for watching, and see you again next time.